Good morning, everybody, or it may be just getting into your afternoon. We've got a few people who are just still being admitted from the waiting room. So I'm going to start and do some introductions while we have people coming in. Thank you. I can see people have got their cameras and their sound off as we start coming in. So again, welcome everybody. On behalf of Pracy, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I'm Denise Luscombe, Chair of Pracy, so professionals and researchers in early childhood intervention, and I have the pleasure of introducing this session and our speakers for today. So I would just like to start with a acknowledgement of country. So I'm on Whadjuk Noongar Boodja in Western Australia, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and the lands where you're joining us from today. We also do have people from the United States, from New Zealand, and quite possibly from Ukraine who are joining us today as well. So welcome. From wherever you are coming. I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. This is being recorded, as you can see, and will be available as well afterwards. So as people are coming in, I would like to thank Trish and Sam, who are Pracy directors, for managing the waiting room. They're bringing everybody in, and they will also be managing the chat throughout the session. So thanks, Trish and Sam. Again, while we have people coming in, we would like our time to be as interactive as possible. So we're going to use the chat, hence why we have Trish and Sam managing that. But you can also feel free to come on camera and ask any questions that you have. But as we're bringing people in, I also wanted to ensure everyone is aware of some really important upcoming Pracy events. This first one is the Pracy Conference that's being held in Adelaide in May this year. So coming up very quickly, with early bird registrations due to be closing, I think next Friday. We also have next week, we have the first in a series of Thriving Kids webinars. This first one is really a focus on practice, and we have Professor Frank Oberklade, co-chair of the Thriving Kids Advisory Group, and Dr. Anu Bopti, also Pracy director and a member of the Thriving Kids Advisory Group, presenting. There is a waiting list, but we're trying to bring as many people off that as possible, and there will be plenty of time for Q&A. So if you're interested, please put your name on the waiting list. We've also just released a Pracy Thriving Kids discussion paper, which I will put into the chat for you as well. The other important things coming up is that from March to August this year, Kerry Bull and myself, and I think Kerry's online as well, will be returning to all states and territories to follow up from the consultations relating to development of the National Best Practice Framework for Early Childhood Intervention. And this is based on requests from the consultations, and we have one day that are free workshops and consultations on implementation of the framework and the commencement of the development of professional, or discussions on the development of professional standards. And also on the second day, we have this workshop, which is the Brisbane one. If you're in Brisbane, there's a QR code for you, but I'll also stick some links in the chat. And if you're in Sydney, there is one there. They will go to all states and territories. These are the ones that we currently have open at the moment. So we would love to see you at some of these, because as we know, coaching is a really important way that we work with other adults in the early childhood intervention and early childhood education and care sector. Lastly, some of these are paid events, but if you do join Pracy and have a membership, there is always a member fee, and it is probably one of the best value memberships around. So again, I will put these links in the chat. If you're quick enough, you can grab the QR code and join as a Pracy member. Okay, have we got anybody still left in the waiting room? No, we have everybody in, it looks like. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and I am going to ask Mia or Courtney if you would like to share your PowerPoint. But I would like to introduce our two speakers today who will take us through this really important topic. We can see by the amount of people who are attending that this is something that a lot of people are very interested in. The topic is Unpacking Early Childhood Expulsion and the Intersections with Trauma-Informed Care. So thank you to Mia and Courtney for being with us from the United States. And I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourselves.
All right. Hi, everyone. We're really excited to be here and to talk about early childhood expulsion and the intersections with trauma-informed care. I'm Mia Chudzik. I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Illinois. And before getting my PhD, I worked both as a preschool teacher in the United States with kiddos 3 to 5 with disabilities, and then also in early intervention doing home visiting for young children with disabilities. And my research really focuses on the use of trauma-informed care in early childhood settings, and expulsion is a line of my work because expulsion, as we'll talk about today, often causes trauma for kids and families and is kind of an opposition of what it means to be trauma-informed.
And hello, everybody. I'm Courtney O'Grady. I'm an assistant professor in early childhood special education at the University of Alabama. And we always
Sure.
like to start with introductions and kind of positioning because we know that research is never neutral. And Sami and I talk a lot about this in our work that we bring a lot of our own personal lived experiences to this work. So for me, like me, I come from the perspective of having taught in inclusive classrooms for a long time and definitely having children whose behaviors I struggled to support at times. But I primarily come at this as the parent of two boys, one of whom is 18 and one is 14. And both of them experienced exclusionary discipline at various points in their educational careers. My oldest has has a pretty significant attention deficit disorder, and he really struggled with that when he was little. And I just will never ever forget the experience years and years ago of being in a meeting where my husband and I were on one side of the table and 7 professionals were on the other side of the table. And in 2 hours, we did not hear one positive thing about our child. And at the end of that meeting, we decided mutually to part ways and have him not return to that school. And I thought we were off the hook with my younger son until last spring when he had to serve a 2-day all school in school suspension for doing something which he shouldn't have. But he put ketchup packets under the toilet lids in the boys' bathrooms so that when you put the lid down, the ketchup would squirt. So now both of my boys have experienced exclusionary discipline. And so a lot of my work does focus on ending exclusionary practices and then also really pushing back against deficit-based narratives around children and families, particularly young children with disabilities, and just doing everything, both of us do everything we can to advance inclusion and improve outcomes for young children and their families.
So we kind of have 3 sections of this presentation. We're going to start with an overview of expulsion, and the data that we share is primarily US centered because the study that we're going to talk about took place in the United States. And then we're going to go into details on this one study that we conducted together about expulsion and what it looks like when it's not trauma informed. And then we'll wrap up by talking about what's next and how we can all work together to help address this issue of expulsion. And there'll be time after each of these sections for questions. We'll pause and ask, and then we're also saving time for a longer discussion at the end of the presentation as well.
So first, we thought before we got into the study, we thought it might be helpful to just give kind of a little bit of overview of the context that we're coming from and what kind of informs this work from a US perspective. So just to kind of be all on the same page as far as definitions. So when we say expulsion, we're referring to any instances where children are permanently removed from an early childhood setting. This can be done through 2 different ways, which is important to recognize because families don't always recognize this. So it could be done officially. So that's when the program officially says, you can't come back tomorrow, you need to find somewhere else. Or what we see a lot of is what we refer to as soft expulsion. And those are instances where programs enforce practices or policies that really make sustained enrollment impossible. So things like calling parents to pick up their child early, offering an adapted schedule. So school might be in session for 6 hours, but that child's only allowed to come for 1 hour. So things like that where families feel as though they have no other option but to withdraw their child because policies have made sustained enrollment just impossible. And in the United States, we're particularly concerned because young children with disabilities continue to be routinely excluded from early childhood settings. And young children with disabilities are much more likely to be expelled than their peers without disabilities. And we see a really concerning phenomenon here where there's oftentimes a false conflation of challenging behavior and disability. So we see a lot in our literature that there's this kind of reinforcing this notion that children with disabilities are inherently more challenging, which then kind of implicitly justifies their exclusion. And we also are seeing a lot of why this is important is because, as we'll mention later as we get in through the study and talk about some of our follow-up work, is we're seeing children expelled sometimes not because of what we would think of as typically challenging behaviors, but just because of their disability status, or they're being denied enrollment in a child care program because of their disability status. So just some additional context, access, unfortunately, to childcare in the United States, so for kids really under the age of 5, is notoriously extremely difficult and also extremely expensive. And that's universal. That's for all children. It just gets increasingly difficult if you have a child with a disability. And then just some general data around expulsion. So through this project and then a follow-up project, we've talked to families who've had their babies expelled. So this can be our first question. And you can put in the chat, what would you guess an infant would be expelled for? Biting is a good guess. Crying is, yep. So babies are being expelled because they're crying. So, and we know that's a developmentally expected behavior, just as biting is. Also in the United States, there was a seminal study that came out over 20 years ago that noted that preschoolers, so in our context, that means kids generally ages 3 to 5, are expelled 3.2 times more than kids in our kindergarten through 12th grade combined. Boys, and there's huge disparities within expulsion related to demographic factors. So boys make up only 54% of public preschool enrollment, but 78% of suspensions. Black children make up about 8.2% of preschool enrollment, but 43% of suspensions and 38% of expulsions. As I mentioned before, children with disabilities are more likely to be expelled. They're expelled 2.5 times more than children without disabilities. And related to the study we're about to tell you about, children who have experienced trauma are also much more likely to be expelled. So we know in our system that there's a lot of different factors that can impact expulsion. It is a decision that's mediated by adults. So there's a lot of interplay with teacher factors, teachers who are more stressed, more overwhelmed, don't have supports, and just feel like they have no other option are more likely to expel. There are also, as we mentioned, parent and child demographics, which make children more likely to be expelled, program factors, access to supports and resources, family and program interactions. There's research that shows if early educators have a difficult relationship with the parent and with the child, they're much more likely to expel. But if they have a positive relationship with the parent, they're much more likely to try harder to keep the child enrolled. And then we're also seeing a little bit of an uptick in legislation at the federal level or at the state level, prohibiting expulsion in publicly funded programs. And then there have been some federal position statements that have come out asking and urging early educators not to use these practices anymore. But what we've seen is, despite some initial forward momentum in trying to end these practices, they're still happening. What we're seeing is a lot more of those soft expulsions that I mentioned, where they're not considered official and they might not be officially documented. And we're still seeing the same disparities perpetuate. So overall expulsion rates might be going down, but kids with disabilities, kids of color, boys, kids who have experienced trauma are all still being excluded more than their peers without those demographic um, identities. And then lastly, just to kind of set an additional piece of context, the definition that we're using to ground our discussion about trauma-informed care is we're talking about an approach to care that really focuses on responding to already existing trauma and also preventing future trauma from occurring. So I just want to pause there for a second and see if there are any clarifying questions we can answer before we get to this study. Okay, great. I think we have multiple people monitoring the chat, so if stuff comes up while we're talking, we'll see it.
All right, so now we'll dive into this research study that Courtney and I did. Um, Next slide, please. And the purpose of this study was to use a trauma-informed lens to examine caregivers' experiences when their young child with a disability experienced an expulsion from an early childhood setting. Courtney and I had been on projects related to expulsion before and noticed that trauma came up a lot, even though we weren't explicitly asking questions about it. Families had either disclosed that they and or their child had experienced trauma before the expulsion, and then the expulsion compounded that trauma. So we were interested in looking at this data through that trauma-informed lens. And that led to our research question of in what ways does the experience of early childhood expulsion contribute to the traumatization or re-traumatization of children and their caregivers? We used this framework from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, to kind of guide this study. SAMHSA is an organization dedicated to supporting mental health in the United States. They were kind of the first organization to create a framework related around trauma-informed care in the US. And so they kind of are at the forefront of this work on what it means to be trauma-informed. And they've identified four assumptions of a trauma-informed approach. The first is to realize the widespread impact of trauma, to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, to respond by integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and to resist re-traumatizing. So we were looking at the data through this theoretical framework, trying to see where caregivers described that participants were or that practitioners were or were not recognizing the signs of trauma in their child, or where they were or were not responding by using trauma-informed practices in their classrooms. We used something called convenience and snowball sampling to recruit for the study. So we reached out to families who personally members of the research team knew had experienced expulsion, and then also posted on social media groups. And then as we got participants, that kind of snowballed where they'd refer people that they knew to participate in the study. We used semi-structured interviews as our main source of data collection. So it was Courtney who did these interviews with the caregivers, and we asked them to talk about the expulsion experience, what they think led up to the expulsion, the impacts that it had on them and their child and their greater family unit, things like that. We conducted member checks with participants where we created a summary of the interview and then shared it back with them. And that was to kind of help promote the credibility of the study and to make sure that what we were interpreting as important parts of the study, they are or of their story, they also felt were important. And then we engaged in something called an iterative analysis to analyze the data, which I will touch on next or in a little bit. So we had 26 caregivers who participated. They were mostly white married mothers, although there was one father and a grandparent or two, I believe. There was quite the range of ages, 25 to 49 years old, and they mostly identified as being in the middle class.
to note, because it came up in the chat, that we did not set limits on what settings children were
Mhm.
enrolled in. So they were enrolled in childcare, family childcare, public preschool. We were open to any early childhood setting.
Yeah. So we had 26 children who were represented in this study. They were mostly boys, which does represent who is most likely to be expelled. They ranged in age from infants to early elementary age. In fact, three of the children who were expelled were under one at the expulsion, and there were five total who were under the age of two. And almost all children had a disability, and we asked caregivers to define the disability. So they could say, we didn't follow IDEA, which is our mandated special education law in the United States. We didn't use those categories. Parents could self-identify what disability their child had, and there was quite the range. So then we engaged in this collaborative data analysis process where we coded the data first by making a code book or a coding scheme where we took those four assumptions of trauma-informed care and then created codes for those. So we would be looking for when participants were responding to the signs of trauma or when they weren't responding, when they were realizing or when they weren't realizing. Courtney and I each read the transcripts separately and coded, and then met to discuss how we were coding, and we came to consensus on if there were any differences in how we coded. And then we met to identify themes. So we were looking for relationships among the codes and across the interviews, and to identify key themes and findings and quotes that really summarized these participant stories and that answered our research question. We had three main themes that I'll touch on. The first was that caregivers reported that early childhood settings and professionals are not prepared to support their children who have experienced trauma, and that mapped onto the recognize and the respond component of that SAMHSA framework. The second was that caregivers reported that having their child expelled from an early childhood program was a source of trauma for both themselves and their child, which maps onto the resist re-traumatization component. And the final finding was that caregivers reported that larger systemic issues, like navigating complex bureaucratic service systems, contributed to the trauma that they and their children experienced. And that mapped onto the recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization pieces. And we'll go more in depth into each of these. So that first theme, which was about early childhood settings are not prepared to support children who have experienced trauma, we had two sub-themes under that. The first one was that we found that early childhood professionals' perceptions of children's behavior is what really led to the expulsion from the caregiver point of view. They were often described as viewing behavior as challenging or disruptive, not as a result of trauma or as a coping mechanism that these children have. So, for example, one caregiver described her child who was adopted from foster care and how her behavior was mislabeled and misinterpreted by the professionals. And she said, my child is misunderstood. She's had bad behaviors over the years because she's with people who didn't understand her or didn't know that her behaviors were coping responses. And then we saw that because these professionals did not have knowledge of trauma or trauma-informed care, didn't have the skills and the training with it, that the practices and the policies that they used in response to children's behavior often compounded issues. So that would be things like excluding children from certain activities, secluding children in a separate classroom with an aide or in a part of the classroom by themselves, and even engaging in restraint practices. So, one participant described how she saw her child get treated. And she said they started this burying thing where they would grab those cushions and they would bury him into the middle of the cushions until he was done with his meltdown. So we saw practices like that that would be traumatic for kids and for caregivers to witness their child experiencing. There's a hand raised. Do you want me to address that now? Yes, Sam.
Yeah, the question was just regarding, like, could you clarify why not prepared means? So did that mean they didn't have adequate knowledge or and training, or they weren't open to it?
Um, we didn't talk to the practitioners themselves, so we won't be 100% certain on that answer. But from what parents shared with us or caregivers shared with us, it seemed that they weren't using those trauma-informed practices. And we don't exactly know if it's from a lack of training or a lack of interest in it. Courtney, would you agree?
I would say it was almost both that we heard more.
Yeah.
Definitely from our analysis, we saw that teachers are not adequately prepared when it comes to the trauma piece. Definitely, you can see that. Like, why would you bury a child that had experienced trauma in cushions? Why would you have to be specially trained in the United States to use restraint and seclusion procedures? And given the setting, I would highly, again, we don't know for sure, so this is assumptive, but I would highly doubt that that particular setting was trained in appropriate seclusion and restraint procedures. And then also I would say the not open to it and not wanting to related more to children's disability status, where parents would hear, oh, we can't meet their needs here, or there would be instances of children's needs not being met. So I'm thinking of one example where little girl with physical disabilities was just left in a high chair all day, and that was not appropriate. She wasn't included in activities. She was just kind of parked in the classroom, to put it bluntly. So I would say both.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
And I,
From what the parent shared, this was not an example of providing sensory input. This was after a student was exhibiting what the teacher called challenging behavior, and as like a consequence or a punishment, or because they didn't know how to handle it, they were burying the child in the cushions.
also, just to say too, like we assume the best of intent from teachers. Like our intent with this project or any project we do is not to shame or criticize teachers. Like we recognize that providers are doing the best they can with what they have. So we're in this space of both and of recognizing that that's something you probably
Hmm.
shouldn't do, but also that it was probably done with the best of intentions or innocent intentions.
Yeah. All right. And then the second theme was that expulsion was reported as a source of trauma for both caregivers and their children. The first sub-theme under that we found was that caregivers did report that expulsion caused trauma for their children. They saw changes in their behavior that they recognized in trauma. And in fact, many of the children that were a part of this study had experienced additional sources of trauma at some point before the expulsion, and their caregivers recognized how the expulsion was kind of compounding those experiences from them. So this one participant said, for kids like Clara, that's a pseudonym, who have been through a lot of trauma and disruption, people in and out of her life, and people abandoning her, getting kicked out of daycare is the worst. The second sub-theme was that caregivers reported the expulsion as a traumatic event for themselves as well. And they spent a lot of time talking about the impact the expulsion had on them, both short term and long term. One participant talked, well, many of them talked about how it led to a really big mistrust of early childhood settings and kind of the education system as a whole. And this one participant, whose quote I'll read, really described how the impact of the expulsion experience is still with her, saying it was very traumatizing just because every time my phone rang or every time the school called, it was that gut wrench reaction like, oh my gosh, what happened now? And Courtney and I have both done studies on expulsion since this one, and something like this comes up in almost every interview where parents have these long-term negative responses to things like interactions from the school or phone calls from the school or things like that. And our final theme was that larger systemic issues contributed to the trauma that caregivers and their children experienced. The first sub-theme is about navigating these complex and multiple systems in order to get appropriate care for their child. And caregivers described having a lot of difficulties navigating those systems. So that could include the early childhood and childcare systems, special education, and child welfare systems. And having to navigate all of that compounded the impact of trauma. So, one participant shared that her child was expelled from a childcare setting and was told to go get evaluated for their local early childhood special education program. And then when she was talking about the evaluation, it didn't really go well. She said, the speech therapist had no idea what to do because my daughter goes into full fight or flight mode and hides under a table. So she's hiding under the table, and the speech therapist says, I don't know how to do the evaluation. And so, because they couldn't get through the evaluation and get all the data, they were stuck in limbo for a bit with no access to early childhood care education for their child because these systems were not communicating with each other and because they were hard to navigate. The second subtheme was about the intersections of racism and ableism. And caregivers did note instances of both racism and ableism in their child's classroom. Caregivers of children of color specifically describe noticing differences in views of behavior and the consequences of that behavior for their children versus white children. So there was one participant who described seeing the same behavior that her son got expelled for, and instead of getting expelled, the program worked with that child longer before leading to expulsion. Whereas for this parent, the behavior happened, and then pretty soon after that, the child was expelled. Another participant was told that her son with Down syndrome could not return to his program because the classroom aide was leaving, and they said they could not accommodate his needs without the aide. And this participant shared the impact the expulsion had on her, saying, I didn't see that I would ever find a place that was going to be able to care for her, or that I wouldn't be able to accomplish my own goals when her needs aren't being met. So they talked about not only the impact that this had on their child, but also on them and their ability to keep doing the other things in their life that they wanted to do, that this was impacting. So all this data led us to a few main takeaways. One was we saw that caregivers and children from historically marginalized backgrounds are more likely to experience trauma, which we know is more likely to lead to early childhood expulsion, which can then lead to additional traumas for these children and families. So this really unfortunate cycle that happens with trauma and expulsion. We also know that early childhood programs have the potential to lay the foundation and to be supportive and be family-centered, but that they can also be a source of harm and trauma for children and caregivers that then stays with them throughout their schooling experiences. And finally, we know that early childhood teachers and programs need professional development opportunities and support to realize, recognize, respond to, and actively resist re-traumatizing young children in early childhood settings. These were some implications that stood out to us. And again, we conducted this study in the United States in one state of Illinois. So some of these are pretty context specific, but they can apply across different settings. So Illinois recently passed a law that requires all public school staff members to receive training on trauma and trauma-informed practices starting in 2025. And we thought that was really great and is certainly needed. But we were really frustrated because that law was for K to 12 settings only and didn't apply to these early childhood settings where these kiddos were being expelled from. And there was also no current direction on what counts as training on trauma and trauma-informed practices. So maybe for one program that looks like they put on a video for teachers that's 10 minutes long. Or for another program, maybe they spend more time actually learning about these topics and reflecting on their practice. So we thought this law was a great start, but is a good example too of like how sometimes policy misses the point and isn't going to support early childhood folks. The second thing that we thought about is Courtney and I both support pre-service teachers. And so we were thinking about recommendations for embedding content on trauma across pre-service early childhood licensure programs. So when students are learning to be teachers, how do we ensure this content isn't isolated so it doesn't seem like I took this one class on trauma and now I'm good and I can be trauma informed when I need it, but rather that you're embedding it in things like curriculum and assessment and classroom management. So it's more like a lens that teachers always use and not just, I'm going to pull it out if I think this kid has experienced trauma. We also thought a lot about what other active ingredients and supports early childhood personnel need in order to be trauma informed and hopefully prevent further expulsions, and how we can avoid stigmatizing or continuing these stereotypes or perceptions of children and families that may inadvertently lead to further harm. Any questions about the study before we move on to what's next? Great. Okay.
All right, so then we thought next that just really quickly we could tell you a little bit about a couple of follow-up projects that we've done, and then we're hoping to have a good few minutes for a robust discussion about everything. So we've engaged in some follow-up projects that were inspired by this project that we've just been talking about. So one follow-up project that we did was we noticed through these conversations of just how convoluted families' experiences were and how we kind of take for granted what our system should be versus what the lived experiences of these families, particularly for um, families of a child with a disability. So we think of like the process of having a baby, enrolling a baby in care outside the home for the first time, and then getting set up once there's compulsory school age, that should be a fairly linear process. It should almost be like a straight line if you were to draw it out. But then from talking to families, we saw that their experiences were anything but. So we did this follow-up project, which I'll explain, and then I see the question in the chat, which I'll answer in just a second. We were really interested in continuing to explore the experiences of families with a child with a disability and what that experience looked like. So we really wanted to look at the journey of families with a young child with a disability. So our research questions were, how do families whose young children with a disability who were expelled from an early childhood program describe their experiences? And how did those expulsions impact families' subsequent educational experiences? So for this, we wanted to use slightly different methods. So we asked families to do a process called journey mapping, which is rooted in disability studies and disability and critical race studies, or DISCRIT. So I know it's kind of hard to see, and I did do my best photo editing with the black Sharpie tool thing to black out there, because this is a child's actual experience. There are pieces of identifiable information in there regarding schools, names of teachers and things, but you can see all these things that this family experienced before that child turned 5, all these different points of medical crises, which were kind of barriers to care, enrollment, being told to leave, being forced, like you can see the mom drew a picture of a brick wall, so feeling like she was up against a brick wall. This child in particular was expelled from an inclusive setting and then pushed into a more segregated setting. And this was, I would say, a kind of a typical map that we ended up being able to look at of all these different twists and turns that families had to take on their journeys just to arrange care for their child. So similar to the study we just talked about, we had very similar demographics. We talked to 10 mothers, 10 different mothers. In this study too, there were 8 boys who experienced expulsion and 2 girls. The youngest was a baby who was expelled at 9 months old for crying. There was also a toddler who was expelled, 4 3-year-olds, 2 4-year-olds, and 1 5-year-old. So before I go to the next slide, I'll address the question that for children enrolled in their school district special education programs, did FAPE offer any protections? So this is an important point, I think, to clarify. Not every child was diagnosed with their disability at the time of the expulsion. So a lot of times programs will start to suspect that there's something going on with a child or that a child needs additional supports. But rather than going through the process for referral and diagnosis, they'll expel. And so it takes a little bit longer, similar to what you'll see on the map. Sometimes it takes longer for families to get connected to services. So the way the law works in the United States, you do have protections under the federal law that Mia mentioned, IDEA, but you only um, receive those protections if you're receiving services under IDEA, if that makes sense. So children with disabilities might not be receiving services yet, so they wouldn't be protected by that. And also, families aren't always aware of their rights. Families will share, like, this is my first baby. I'm barely figuring out how to keep them alive, let alone like know what my rights are as a parent of a child with a disability. So we see things all the time where under a different law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, you are federally prohibited from discriminating against a child with a disability, but programs do it all the time because they're not aware of that. And sorry, so we throw around acronyms. FAPE stands for Free Appropriate Public Education.
Also, really quick, I'll add to that in Illinois, it's illegal to expel any child from a public childcare program, but we are from a public preschool program, but we know that's still happening. So just because there's policies in place, it doesn't always prevent these issues.
And that's too is where you'll see a lot of those soft expulsions where programs know that they can't officially expel a child, but they'll find ways around it. Yes, so FAPE is relevant to American policy. And then just really quickly, some of the themes that came up in this follow-up project were very similar to what we heard in this one, that families are being told explicitly, your child does not belong. Programs are saying, I just don't think I can do this. I'm not prepared to meet their needs. In this study, there were more children with more complex medical needs that programs were much more hesitant to support, citing liability concerns. We noticed that families were pushed from an initial maybe inclusive setting into further and further segregated settings. We noticed that families recognized that we have a pretty ableist system. We also had several moms that said that even if they did know their rights and know that their rights were being violated, they didn't want their child to be at a school where they weren't wanted or to be with caregivers that were only continuing the enrollment because they were afraid of a lawsuit. And then also, rather poignantly, a lot of mothers really mentioned the impact that this had on them in particular as mothers, that they, had to, with left with no other options, families sometimes had to stay, or mothers had to stay home with their babies, and mentioned, loss of income, loss of promotion opportunities. One mother shared that this would impact her earning potential for the rest of her career. Just one little follow up, and then Mia has one more.
Yeah, so then kind of similarly, Courtney and I have been talking about how there's a lot of research out there on the impacts of expulsion on children and families, but we were really curious about where do we go from here. So we've caused this harm, and now what can we do to promote healing and to create a better environment? So we did another study that involved vision boarding, which I'll show you. And our research questions were, what do caregivers describe as the ideal early childhood education setting for their child with a disability? And how does experiencing early childhood expulsion impact that vision? 9 mothers participated. There were 8 boys and 1 girl who were expelled, all with disabilities. And again, they were all expelled between the ages of 3 to 5. And here's an example of the vision board. So we told participants to make a vision board. It could include images, words. They could hand draw it if they wanted, make it on a computer. So here's an example of one that's kind of a collage of different images they felt represented what the ideal early childhood setting looked like. And we found 3 main themes that kind of tell the story of these participants. The first was blame and rejection, which was that the expulsion experience was colored by these feelings of blame and rejection centering around their child's disability. These participants all reported that their child with a disability was expelled because of manifestations of that disability specifically. The second was this theme of broken trust, which was that the expulsion experience led to broken trust towards early childhood programming and kind of schools in general. And the third theme, which was probably the most sad, was the bare minimum, which was we asked participants, like, if you could want anything in the whole wide world in this early childhood program, what would you want? And it really boiled down to One, they wanted open communication between them and their child's teacher. They want to be able to share openly with the teacher and have the teacher share openly with them. And two, they wanted their child with a disability to be fully supported and accepted. And so we were really wondering, or we were really struck by the idea that that's kind of like the bare minimum of what early childhood programs should be doing for young kids and families, and that it's not happening for a lot of these families.
So that leads us to collectively, we'd love to think together about, well, what can we do? So we have this multitude of studies that are really documenting the issue. We know that kids are experiencing trauma. We know this is not best practices. We know this is causing harm. So we know that there's systems issues that'll take time to address, but we also don't want to be stymied by that and hold off on doing anything because we feel like it's too big. So we'd love for you, we're going to ask you to have just a moment of quiet reflection. And then if you have ideas, things here that are, this is sparking for you, we would love to hear from you. And then we do have some discussion questions as well.
Courtney, it's Denise here. I just heard you mention that there's discussion questions, so I gather they're going to be on the PowerPoint. I just thought if there was any time you wanted to not share, if you wanted people to be all on screen together, feel free, to do that if that might encourage more discussion and interaction. Yeah.
Perfect. I was just thinking that. So why don't I will click through the last couple slides just so everybody can grab our contact information if you want things like that. And then I'll put the discussion questions in the chat. We'll also share our emails in the chat as well so you have them. And then, yeah, let's go in a grid so we can see each other. So these are questions. I'll drop them in the chat as well, but these are just some things, or it looks like Mia will. These are some things that we're thinking about. So what are some research questions that remain underexplored in studies of exclusionary discipline in early childhood education, particularly in relation to systemic and structural inequities? Something we would love to hear your perspectives on are what are some methodological approaches that can support resistance, freedom, and solidarity with children and families against exclusionary discipline? How can we collectively, globally, as researchers, as practitioners, as people committed to the well-being of all young children, how can we intentionally affirm and center the worth, dignity, and agency of children and families, particularly those from historically marginalized backgrounds or communities? And then lastly, how might we conceptualize multi-level intervention that attends to systemic or structural conditions rather than continuing to focus on individual deficit framings? Because what we see so often is interventions are based at fixing or remediating children's behavior to address suspension and expulsion, but we would argue that's not enough, and doesn't ignores all these other things that we've talked about. Really quickly, we do want to acknowledge our colleagues that were part of the research team that are not here with us tonight, and also just the hugest thanks of the caregivers that shared their stories with us. We cried with participants as they told their stories. We just so appreciate their vulnerability, their honesty, and we both just feel like such responsible stewards of the stories that we were entrusted with. So I want to acknowledge that. And then lastly, here's a QR code and a link to the article from the study that we talked about. It is published. We're also happy to send it to you. And I will stop sharing so we can see each other.
Sorry, I was talking to myself. It's Denise here again. I'm just trying to get myself on camera. I just wanted to let you know as well, because we did a research snapshot on that article, and I did give that as for everybody's information as well. So that's available on the Précy website if people not only wanted the article but also a brief summary of it, if you like, which can be useful as well.
Great, thank you.
Yes, Sarah has a point in the chat about maybe some private childcare centers have the best of intentions, but then end up using techniques that actually are causing long-term behaviors to develop because of minimal training and education. And I think yes, that is also a concern for us. And again, points to that need for some more top-down supports, right, for all early childhood staff, not just people who are connected to public schools, so that kiddos who are in private childcare centers are also getting the best of care.
So I don't know if this is, yeah, just I guess the question lingering in my mind throughout listening to that presentation, and thank you, that was very informative and thought-provoking and sounds like very, centered on the strengths of the kids. And I guess, yeah, the question there is I guess I'm working with a child with quite significant behavior due to a lot of various diagnoses. And what I'm seeing with him in his early childhood childcare center is he's a lot of children are becoming traumatized from his behavior and very scared and there's a lot of physical aggression, and there's a widespread impact beyond him. And I guess that question is what I think is a really important exploration, and you're probably already doing this, but just bridging that gap to what's the missing piece there so he can be included in this educational system and doesn't get left behind in life and expelled. And his dad is terrified that he's just going to be kicked out of school and not be able to participate in school. So that's a really important need. And then also keeping everyone else safe and not having that trauma on the other children, and just that very big need there to fill that space so that everyone can be safe and nurtured and included. And yeah, I guess that was just that aspect of safety for everyone.
I do want to share, I'll put the link in the chat, this blog post from an author who I really like, who wrote a book called Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education. And this post is called What About the Other Kids in the Room? And it's talking about that exact scenario about what you can do when there is one or two students who maybe is having a really hard time, and how you can help the other kids make sense of it, and how the message that you send is really important, because the way that that's handled can either teach that like we all have a hard time and we all need supports to get through it, or it can send a message of like you're ashamed or you're bad if you're having a hard time. So I really recommend giving this blog post to read, because I really enjoy it and think it speaks to your example really well.
Yeah, thank you. That would be great.
Mm-hmm.
There's another question there. Can you see that, Courtney and Mia, or shall I read it out?
I see that so often the focus is on fixing or changing the child's behavior and fails to understand the real needs of the child to address the impact of the environment, and how modifying environments as well as supporting the learning and functional skills of staff will impact the child's responses and interactions in busy childcare settings. Absolutely. So we both have done a little bit of work with the pyramid model, if you're familiar, where it's this tiered model of support. And the idea is that the very top of the pyramid need for intensive interventions, and people always want to jump to that top point first without considering, have you put every other support and other, I mean, what is your environment like? How are you co-regulating as an adult? What is your own well-being like? What is your circle time or your group time too long? All these other things. And yeah, kind of taking a step back. Also, I'm thinking of like just core reminders of what's developmentally expected behavior. Babies are going to cry, toddlers are going to bite, 3-year-olds are going to hit. And I think there's a lot of pressure on kids to conform to expectations that are not developmentally appropriate or are based in norms based that are reflective of the dominant culture sometimes, and not reflective of the tiny humans that are in the room.
So yeah, going back, I didn't see, sorry, whose name it was who was asking about the like the other children. I'm really looking forward to reading that blog that you shared. That looks great. I've noticed that's a common one that gets brought up, and the way that I've seen I guess it'd be effective in terms of helping upskill the staff, like the staff in the center, is to, if possible, to and this is in Australia and Victoria, we have this model of funding that I use to go into them sometimes, called school readiness funding, and modeling for them how to do that. So helping them understand how to address the needs of the other children, whether it be like a debrief or kind of explaining in an age appropriate way, that it's not, this child is still learning. They're not, we're trying to support them at that space and whatnot. But ensuring that, yeah, we consider um, all of it, both sides of it, because it's definitely a common thing tend to come up with. And I think when explain it to them and show them how to speak to the kids about it, that really makes a big difference. Yeah, sorry.
And I think it's so interesting with the issue of safety. And so a colleague of mine brought this up to me that we tend to kind of stratify safety. And so we get really concerned with children's physical safety because there might be a child that's being bitten or being hit. But then, based on everything we've been talking about and shared with you, then emotional safety seems to be kind of lower or not as valued, and that we're much more willing to kind of let the emotional safety of kids. And recognizing that what was shared, that it can be emotionally difficult for children to be experiencing a child that's needing additional support for their behaviors, but also for that child, knowing that expulsion would result almost certainly in a harm to their emotional safety. So it is, I mean, and there's no quick or easy answer. That's why we all should make a lot more money in doing this, because it's really hard. And so I just think that's important to recognize too, that it is such a balancing act in there. Um, I've been the parent too, that's my child has come home with a scratch on his face and was really upset, like, well, you didn't go to school with a scratch on your face. What happened? Kind of thing. So, yeah, just lots of things to think about.
That's a great point. And yeah, I have tricky kids. I've been the parent as well. And it's definitely all angles.
And sometimes these things, like, the example in the chat of a child with separation anxiety, and so they seem hesitant or they don't accept co-regulation, that can take a long time. Like building emotional safety often takes much longer than building physical safety. And if we don't have realistic expectations of what that looks like and the time it takes, that can make it much more tricky to focus on and to really meaningfully implement.
Mia and Courtney, we are right at the end of time. So there's a couple more comments in the chat there, but I think if you want to have a read, and others can see the chat there as well. But I just wanted to thank you very much for your time today in sharing your research. And I think those research questions, I think many people would be interested in some research that actually goes across countries, that really supports that collaborative research, because I think what you're hearing is the same thing is happening in in other places. So being able to collaborate on that and learn from each other would be fantastic. So as I will send out again the link to your research snapshot that's on our website. Thank you for the additional information. I'll also include that, so if people haven't grabbed it from the chat. But again, really appreciate your time and the amount of time and your passion for this area that goes into the research that you're doing as well. We really need more of it, and look forward to hearing about some of the other outcomes. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you everybody else for being online. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, but please take advantage of all the information that you've received from today. Have a great day.